This is the Converge Podcast, brought to you by the Converge Institute. Each week, brilliant minds specializing in AI, blockchain, and fintech come together to challenge the status quo and empower disruption. Sponsored by our founding council, Nakusa, BankSocial, the Texas Blockchain Council, and the Universal AI University.
Lee, what's up?
Good morning.
Good morning. Back to another Converge podcast. We've got a really cool guest today, don't we?
We do. I'm excited. A mutual friend of ours who's done a lot of exciting things in his career, ranging from faculty member at the Air Force Academy to starting several companies, an identity company, and also the topic of our conversation today, Hedera Hashgraph.
That's right. Mr. Mance Harmon. Mance, how are you doing today?
Hey guys, I'm doing very well, thank you. You know, it just occurred to me in this moment that this is not the first time that Lee and I have done a podcast together.
Do tell.
Actually, Lee, you remember the details better than I do, but way back when you were still faculty at DBU, maybe even, I don't know if you were faculty at that point or even pre-faculty, but you had a podcast back then. Is that right?
We did. We had a podcast called Dallas Blockchain, and Mance was one of our first interviews.
So did this predate the TBC?
It
Obviously,
did.
predated.
Yeah,
is this the first time you guys met?
You know, we met.
It was pretty early.
Yeah, I
When
think
did we meet?
we met in Dallas at the either the Tower Club or the Petroleum Club. You were giving a talk, and I remember you were on stage, and then Gideon Powell was on stage right after you. So it was a great event. It was, and I came up to you afterwards and just said, "Hey, I'm studying this space from an academic perspective, and would love to get dive a little bit deeper." And so we scheduled a podcast.
Give us a timeline. When was this? 2015,
Probably
2016?
2018.
Oh, 2018.
Maybe 2017, 2018, because I remember ICOs were the rage at the time.
Yeah, kind of classifying the timeline by where in crypto we were. We were in ICO phase.
Yeah. I mean, 2017 was the year for ICOs, and it was the case that we had maybe we hadn't kicked off Hedera. I don't remember, but we were talking about Hashgraph quite extensively in the fall, summer through the end of 2017 up to March of 2018. And it might have been during that time when we first spoke, something like that.
And that was kind of that just after you guys released the white paper too for Hashgraph, right, Mance? You guys released that in 2016, mid-year.
No. The white paper that everyone thinks of as the white paper was March of 18, because the white paper we released at the same time that we had the big presentation, the Sony PlayStation Theater there in Manhattan on Broadway. And so that was March 18th. I remember that date. And I'm pretty sure that the white paper was published at that point in time, because that was the first time that, the world was wondering what were we going to do with Hashgraph. And that was the first time that we really put in paper in a way that everyone could easily consume and see all the details. And we introduced that along with that presentation there in March 18th.
So talking a little bit more about y'all's kind of together story when you guys came together, what happened after that? What happened after that event? How'd you guys connect after that? You just stayed in touch and then it blossomed?
Yeah, we stayed in touch, and the TBC started to come together, and Mance was, Hedera in general was one of our first member companies actually back then. I think there was some promise at the state level to do some enterprise blockchain work, and we got one of those pilots through the Texas Secretary of State. But as things go, the appetite for that kind of risk taking with those agencies just sort of dried up a little bit, and so it kind of ebbed and flowed as far as like what we could do with the state of Texas. So.
And when was this? When was this kind of the founding of the TBC, just so everybody kind of understands when this was all going down?
Yeah, I think the pilot was 2020, if I'm not mistaken. But
what was it for?
It was the Secretary of State. I think it was apostilles, if I remember correctly. Is that right, Mance?
That was the first one that I recall. Yeah. The details are sketchy. It's been a while back, but I do remember one conversation in particular. And it was even prior to that. It was like at the very, very beginning. I was at home over the weekend and I was reading about blockchain services network that China was pursuing through a private company. It is, it's a private company sponsored by the Chinese government. So, and Sunday after church, I got home from church and been thinking about it all weekend. I remember giving Lee a call. I don't know if you remember this phone call.
I do. I was sitting on my front porch and we were talking about a Texas blockchain services network.
Wow.
Yes.
How cool.
Yeah, that was the idea. It was a Texas blockchain services network, and we decided that let's give it a go. And Lee, of course, took the bull by the horn, so to speak, and did a great job. We supported as Hedera, but it really was a support function, and it turned into what TBC is today.
And this has always been, so he was there for the founding. You guys were together for the founding. Was that the founding day? Like, was that call the foundational element of the spark that created the TBC?
I will tell you that it was either the first, I think Vertalo, Dave Hendricks in Austin, which I know Mance knows Vertalo. It's a digital transfer agent.
Yep.
And Hedera were the first two corporate members. I can't remember which one was first, but I know it was either Vertalo or Hedera.
But it was in this time where TBC was founded and you
Yeah.
guys kind of went down this
Well, this
path
was
together.
COVID. So we were having all of these virtual meetings and I would bring in an elected official to just, they're wanting to gain some traction with the community and talk about innovation. And so every time we'd have one of these monthly calls, one of these elected officials would come on and talk about a policy idea. And that's how it really started. And then it was pretty grassroots from there. And that's been 5 years ago now.
Wow. So on the heels of innovation, I know that you guys, Mance, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. We were talking about Hedera's move to open source the entire code base for Hashgraph, right? That just, I think it's been the code base has been open source, but this is an entirely new development. Why don't you talk us through that a little bit and what Hedera has just done? Because frankly, I haven't had a lot of time to, so be as detailed as you can, because I'd really like to poke into that a little bit. And then Lee, I want to talk to you a little bit about open source generally in the space.
Sure. Well, so you point out correctly that we've been open source for a long time. I don't remember when exactly we went open source, but it's been a few years since we've actually had an open source code base, meaning that on GitHub, anyone can go and download the code base, and it says open source in every source file, and you can use it however you want. A developer could take it and modify it to in whatever ways they want to modify it and use it if they so chose to do. And so what's new here is that we've taken the entire code base and we've contributed it to the Linux Foundation. So Linux, of course, is the premier foundation for open source, open source code bases. And especially in the enterprise world, there are, hundreds of enterprise organizations that are members of the Linux Foundation and use those resources that are provided by the foundation. So Linux has made the decision to create a sort of an umbrella for any blockchain or DLT related contributions. They're calling it the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, and it's going to be governed under the auspices of Linux, but it will have its own governance as well, just for the blockchain or DLT projects that are contributed to that. And we're the first premier contributor, and we've taken the entire code base and we've contributed it to Linux. What that means practically is that Linux will now have responsibility for the management and the promotion, the marketing, if you will, of that code base to its existing user base, its existing customers. So of course, Hedera is the ideal platform for enterprise. And the fact that we've taken this step really plays into that, because enterprise will now have access to it through Linux and have all the benefits of having it governed and managed through Linux. Now, when I say governed, that's the code base. The code base now exists as a Linux code base. The project name, by the way, is Hira.
Yeah, Hira. I was going to ask you how to pronounce that. Hira.
Yeah, it's short for, or it's meant to sound sort of like hieroglyphics. And Hira is the name. And it's separate. It's an important point to make that this is separate and distinct from the governance of the Hedera code base. So the Hedera code base, you can think of the Hedera code base now as an operational instance of the Hira code base that is under the Linux Foundation
A
decentralized.
fork? Can we think of it as a fork, Mance?
Well, it's not a fork because it is the exact same code base today, right? It would become a fork if it were the case that there was a need to have a different version of the Hedera code base than what is hosted by Linux. So there could end up being multiple, hypothetically, there could end up being multiple forks, if you will, under Linux. But at the moment, we just contributed it. And so it's the exact same code base, but the code base that is run on the nodes that are, the council nodes within the Hedera ecosystem is an instance of that code base.
And that code base that runs the Hedera nodes, that's running on the Hedera nodes, the council nodes, that's maintained still by Hedera.
Exactly.
Right?
It's maintained. It's maintained, and it will still be the case. Hypothetically, it could be the case that the Hedera council members decide they want certain features that are not part of the standard code base. I don't know if that will actually happen. It's possible. And if it happens, that's okay. That's what open source is all about. But at the moment, it's the same code base, and it's still the case that the Hedera has a technical steering committee that makes decisions on what proposals get prioritized and what that evolution of that code base looks like. But that's now on the Hedera instance of this. So it's good for the community. It's a first, as far as I know. I don't think there are any other public blockchain code bases that have been contributed to an independent third party like this. It's always the case that it's managed. The code base is managed by their foundation, but now it's, we're looking at something larger than that, and that's the reason for the steps that we've taken.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole ethos of open source is that there's this massive community of developers that can contribute to the furtherance. So, the idea that what Hedera builds in the form of HIPs can be contributed back to the Linux Foundation, this project, right? And that, potentially there could be things that are built and enhanced upon within the Linux version of the code base that the council could choose to interoperably pull back in or push out to Linux, right? Am I kind of summarizing that correctly?
Yeah. So there are a couple things that it's occurred to me are worth stating. One, Lehman's role within this is kind of the same role that Linus Torvalds has for Linux.
Cool.
Right? Lehman controls the core code base. He has, when I say controls, what I mean technically by that is if there's something that's being proposed to go into the code base that would seriously damage or undermine the code or the project in some way, then Lehman has a veto right on that. But of course, that should rarely be exercised. I don't anticipate that it will be exercised. But in the same way that Linus has that right, Lehman has that right for the code base. That's number one. And it is still the case that there is a technical oversight committee on the Linux side, headed by Lehman, that matches, traditional open source best practices that are provided by Linux. So it really is an all-in open source project, like any other open source project that conforms to those best practices. So that's worth saying. And it's the case, as I've already said, that the Hedera will continue to use it and pursue Hedera's interests.
And then is that Lehman the person, or is that Lehman as a part of Hashgraph, the entity that has those controls and those kind of?
It is Lehman the person. It
Oh,
is
wow.
the person. Yeah, yeah. So Lehman, it's an interesting question now that I think about it. I'm sure that Hashgraph probably is in the contract in there somewhere. But when it comes to who by name has the rights that I described, sort of the oversight rights that match the type of rights that Linus has, that's Lehman by name, of course. Yeah.
Man, how cool is that? That's such an amazing development. I mean, the fact that it's the first DLT to be put into this kind of trust environment that now has all the eyes of the open source world. Because one of the things, I've always been an open source developer since I was very, very young. And one of the things that always drew me to open source was the ability for everybody to scrutinize, contribute. The more eyes you have on it, typically the better the code base gets, and the more, ability you have to grow something into something new, or even fork, it becomes, these projects become kind of something that rapid growth, the best of the best come to work on them, just like with Linux. I mean, look at what's happened to Linux itself in the last 35 or 40 years, however long that's been around. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline there, but look at the monster, the absolute awesome thing it's grown into. So many flavors, so many different ways that it's been implemented, and that is so cool that Hedera and Hashgraph have been the first to take that step into this, because I think it's huge. We'll talk real quickly about open source generally in the DLT space. I find it very interesting that DLT almost exclusively, the ones that continue to be the primary drivers of innovation, are not decentralized. And I'm not going to say any names here. I'm sure we could say a lot of names. Not that those haven't been great projects and had use cases that were viable. It's just that the ones that continue to kind of float to the top are the open source, the open source implementations. Lee, what do you think what drives that? Why is Bitcoin, why has it remained open source? Why do the miners continue to contribute to, the team of people? Why do you think that is? What's so important about open source and this kind of, decentralized web movement?
Yeah, I've always described it as private blockchains are, iterating and making things better in some circumstances, but they're not orders of magnitude. They aren't changing things by certain orders of magnitude like public blockchains are. They're not achieving sort of a revolutionary step function change. And so that's kind of what I think, if you're going to tinker, and I'll say a name here like IBM with Hyperledger, that's not necessarily what the market is looking for. In some cases it may be, but it's still a good thing. It's still development, but it's not as radical, if you will, or not as revolutionary as public blockchains. And I think that the really unique place that Hedera has in the market, and Mance, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is a public blockchain that's been open sourced, that has a governing council of respected blue chip organizations across the world. And it's sort of a hybrid model, if you will. I don't even know if that's the right term, but one in which, I would guess, and Mance, correct me if I'm wrong, that Hedera is attracting a lot of sort of entrepreneurs that are within, like, corporate entrepreneurs. They're like, who is the guy that within Boeing or within, Tata Communications or whatever, or the gal that like has this entrepreneurial mindset, but they're part of a massive corporation. They want to innovate. They get a team together. They're building on Hedera. It's probably more of those people and less of like, the DeFi cypherpunk who's probably building on Ethereum or Solana or something. Is that an accurate generalization?
It is, and it has been one of the challenges, frankly, of the project from day one, right? So Hedera does attract sort of the enterprise developer, and that's by design. Obviously, we created the council in the way that we did to engender trust in the enterprise. Enterprise decision makers are looking at the range of public blockchains and deciding who do they trust to have good governance and stability and longevity. They look at the council and there's nothing else like it out there, right? And so it just naturally is appealing to that class or persona of decision maker that's on the enterprise side. The interesting thing, though, is that because of the technology, the technology is fantastic. I mean, just objectively, setting aside all bias, when we can process 10,000 TPS, we have capacity to process 10,000 TPS in a layer one. And so from a developer perspective, you use you write a DApp and you use the transactions on the network and they happen almost instantaneously, which is a very different experience than most of the other layer ones out there for sure, and many of the layer twos. You just don't have the same type of performance that you have in Hashgraph, along with the security. And that is attractive to the full range of developers, right? Developers that are just building startups, but they need fantastic performance and security, but they are clearly a different persona. If you're thinking about this in terms of marketing and you have to focus on a market segment, they're very different classes, if you will, of developers, generally speaking. But we've tried to do some of both. Obviously, we care about the startup community, the small and medium business community, and we are ideal for the enterprise community as well. But Lee, it's a good point, and it's a point that Hedera struggled with, like I said, from the beginning.
Is it necessarily a struggle, or is it more, I mean, it's almost by design? And do you think that once, bigger corporations are building on Hedera, does that just necessarily attract some of the startups that need to sell? Yeah.
It is the case that, if you're a startup, I've said many times, every startup wants to end up being a major enterprise. They start a company. Typically, you start a company and you're starting it because you want to grow it into something big or massive. And so if it's the case that a Boeing or a Google or an Avery Dennison or whomever, any one of the council members decide to be a part of Hedera and are using Hedera, then that of course sends a signal to the startups as well. But if you're just thinking about, and when I say it's a struggle, what I mean by that is if you think about this in terms of marketing, and you have a set of resources that you need to decide what to do with, for your marketing resources, of course, then it's better in general to be targeted and to go all in on a demographic. But it's the case that we care about both. And like I said, we've appealed to both, but it's always been the case that we've had to think about, how to use those resources so that we can address both markets in a way that makes us successful, right? We need to be able to be successful in both markets. That's the struggle that I'm trying to describe.
Well, I think, Mance, just to classify, when you say startup, I think you guys are actually capturing the startup market. Small business is kind of a thing that, if you're a startup, you always want to be that big thing. If you're a small business, like that, you're a small business, you're going to be a small business. You probably never have an intention. I think you guys are capturing the startup, the companies who are really trying to build something for the long term. I think you guys are capturing it.
Well, look, we have a fantastic community. That's the other thing, right? There is a distinction in part between the users at the enterprise level and then the typical Hedera community member, right? The Hedera community members are full of fantastic companies. The Hedera community, rather, is full of fantastic companies that are startups that are building on the project as well. But as I've said, I don't want to suggest that we've ignored it, but we have we have had to market to both. And I think we've got a strong startup community in Hedera, and we've got a good enterprise community as well.
Yeah, from what I see, in Hedera versus a lot of the other, layer ones, layer twos, is there's a more purpose-built startup ecosystem on Hedera. And a lot of the other ecosystems, you get, a lot of memes, a lot of kind of one-off, are these going to be viable business opportunities? You tend to not see as much of that in Hedera. Certainly, I think it's a layer one, it's open source, anybody can build anything anywhere. And so you're just going to get that. Certainly, though, when you look at just the range of solutions on Hedera versus all the other chains, the percentage wise is more viability, more products that have actual business use case. And I think it is because of the way you guys market to, you're coming here to build a future, a viable future for DLT.
Well, I think the community by and large does reflect the ethos that Lehman and I have tried to create for the project in general, right? We came into this very serious minded with the intent of building a company, an organization, an ecosystem that lasts for 100 years. I've said that hundreds of times over the past 10 years. And that, that maturity and seriousness is not only reflected in the way that we've created the council and the thought that went into governance for the technology in addition to the technology, but also in the community. I think that the community recognizes that, and that certain persona gravitates to that kind of purpose-driven, thought in all of this. And yeah, I'm proud of the community. I think the community has done a great job, and I'm expecting it to grow quite a lot in the coming years. And it reflects our ethos.
I've seen a lot of you guys, speaking of the community, I've seen a lot more engagement just generally, versus like the past 2 or 3 years. You guys are really out there engaging not only with enterprises, but the community has been more of a focus. Maybe talk through, Mance, the importance of community, not just for building more products. What are the reasons why building a robust community in this open source DLT, new paradigm of how institutions can be built is important? Why is community important in this open source DLT world?
When you think about the layers, when I think about community, in part, I think about a technology stack, and at the bottom of the stack, what we have today is the Hashgraph consensus algorithm. And then we have a services layer that's built on top of that the developers use. And then in addition to the services, we have various utilities that provide value in some way, typically to the developer community. The developer community wants to use these utilities along with the services. Think of the SDKs, for example. There are SDKs out there that developers can use that make it easy for developers to take advantage of the services. So that's sort of the bottom layer. And then the developers come in and they create all of these services that, again, make it easier for other developers to build upon. And then they build their dApps. And I think of it kind of like a mall. I'm going to use an analogy, right? What you want is to build a mall that is providing the resources needed for the retailers that are going to set up shop in this mall. And the retailers are hoping to market their goods and services to the people that come and visit the mall, right? And what the developers are, they're helping both to build out those companies that are participating in the mall, this ecosystem. Hedera, of course, in this case, has built the infrastructure of the mall itself. Then you get the developers to come in and set up shop in the mall. And they also bring foot traffic to the mall. Now, you have to do integrations even beyond that. So going back to the DLT world, you've got various other third parties that are providing services that have nothing to do with the Hedera network that you need to be integrated with so that you can create a stable coin in 3 days rather than 3 months or 6 months. Because when you go to market with a stable coin solution, just as an example, then you need analytics, an analytics provider, and you need a good custodian, and et cetera, in addition to just the core DLT services that we're providing. So the ecosystem, if you think about this using another analogy as an iceberg, Hedera is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. The ecosystem and all of those integrations and utilities and applications that build out the value of Hedera are all, in this case, below the water level, and they're the most important part. I'm going to use another analogy. Of course, Hedera is an operating system, and there is no value in an operating system unless there are developers using it, and developers build the value of the operating system. So the development community, the ecosystem, Hedera is all important. Hedera is nothing without it. And that's not true just for Hedera. Of course, that's true for all the layer ones. It's true for all platforms. It's true for all platforms. This is not specific to crypto or DLT. It's just the way the modern world and business models of the modern Web 1, 2, and 3 work, and we're no exception to that.
The network effects.
The network effects.
And we're starting to see it in the form of, just in the last handful of months, I think we've seen, just from my perspective, handfuls of critical infrastructure, kind of this second layer of enablement being built on Hedera. Things like HGraph. I don't know if you've seen this HGraph tool. It's like a GraphQL tool that, just that, the ability to write bespoke kind of queries and plugins and do real-time analytical to your point, these are the next layer of foundational tools that will make building on Hedera that much more efficient, that much easier for the next wave of companies that come in and build on top of that. I know we've seen some custodian providers, and we've seen some Oracle providers. These are really the next layer of foundational tools that create these enablements. So I think you guys have done a great job. I try to say I'm not biased, but I believe I'm not biased at looking at it in that way.
We have. I'm gonna share something I didn't intend to share today, but
alpha, get ready.
Yeah, no, well, maybe that much. So, Lehman and I have done these podcasts, First Principles, in the past. So it was an experiment, right? It was an experiment. First Principles was an experiment just to see how the community liked it, and what the community reaction was to it. By and large, I think the community really appreciated those episodes. We are revamping it, and it is going to be a lot more community focused. So we really, when thinking about this and what our goals are, what we want to do is put the spotlight not on me and Lehman, but on the community. And we have the opportunity to do that by virtue of our being the founders of Hedera. So we're going to do exactly that. We're going to revamp it. I'm not going to say much more than that, except to say that it's going to be focused on the community. It's intended to bring a lot of attention to community members and really put the spotlight on those that are doing a great job in the community. And I'll leave it at that.
That's awesome, man. That's another first. I don't see a lot of layer one founders going out of their way to enable community like really Hedera, Hashgraph, and then you and Lehman have done. So thank you and kudos to you. Even with the kind of assistance initially in the TBC, right?
He would never. I don't think the TBC would be what it is today, or it may not even exist without Hedera. So y'all's reinvestment back into the community is phenomenal, and I think much needed.
It's completely unique, and I think this is a really exciting, it is alpha to me. I think that's some alpha right there, that you guys are going to be focusing on community, because I think that right now, just generally across the DLT space, that's a needed component that it sounds like you guys are going to another pioneering kind of step forward in DLT and this new enablement model that we're trying to put. I want to twist a little bit to the Hedera. You guys are so out front as founders. You both have very unique perspectives and personalities. Even though you're aligned, you're both computer science majors or computer scientists. You still have different personalities and the way you go about this. And so you guys are pioneering a lot. I think the one thing that we looked at from the BankSocial perspective was how Hedera could be, how it is quickly becoming the trust layer of the internet. And I wanted to dive into that a little bit. We do have some, we have some financial institutions that watch this podcast and other institutions who may need trust as a part of their ecosystem. I know some of the stuff you guys are doing with projects like Avery Dennison and tracking throughout the logistics process. There's a lot of need for that, especially with AI coming online. So, tell me in your words, what does Hedera being the trust layer of the internet, the trust layer of really commerce, right? In whatever form you slice it, whether that's, technology focused on finance or prop tech or educational tech, you really need a trust layer for data. What does that mean in that form?
For Hedera, that term originated at the very beginning. I don't remember exactly, but it was back in the 2016, 2017 timeframe when we started thinking about it in those terms. And what it means is that there needs to be a way of recording information on the internet, quote, quote, such that it is truly immutable, right? That it can't be altered or changed, but it needs to be public and it needs to come from multiple sources. It needs to be effectively a distributed database that anyone can use and trust that what they see in the database isn't being manipulated by the operators of the database or by anyone that might otherwise attack the content or the information of the database. There needed to be that layer of the internet, as it were, that achieved that. We feel like that we have created that, not just in Hashgraph, but in the services. So, for example, the Hedera Consensus service makes it possible for developers to just record anything they want. They can take a blob of information and submit it to the Hedera Consensus service and get a timestamp on that in almost a fraction of a second. Is it technically? I think it's a couple of seconds. It's less than 3 seconds when it's final, meaning that it will that timestamp on that piece of information is permanent and it will never change in this quote database ever. And you can do, and we do it for a fraction of a penny. A tenth of a cent is the cost to do this. The introduction of that service in particular made it possible for anybody to use the network in the way that I've described and have the properties that I've described, this immutability. That's a building block, right? That's a building block to untold numbers of use cases across all categories of uses, and especially for identity. You can record information in identity use cases, and identity, of course, is core to everything that pretty much exists in this sort of internet world. So that's what it meant to us back then. Again, it was building the foundations that made it possible. I call it plumbing, building the plumbing that made it possible for developers to build really cool use cases that can be trusted by the consumer or by the enterprise, but really required something fundamentally new on the internet, the trust layer of the internet. And that was what we intended to build and take to market. And that's what we have today.
I'm gonna make two comments there. The first one is gonna be, I rarely get to do this, so I'm gonna take the opportunity to correct you. It's a hundredth of a penny, so it's 0.0001, right? Or is my description of a
for the consensus service, you might be right. Is it 100?
I think I am.
Of a penny.
It's a penny of a penny. It's a hundredth of a penny.
You're
Yay.
correct.
Yay.
You're correct. It's a
Once in
penny
a
and a penny.
lifetime. I got it. And then, the other thing here is that trust is not just about technology, it's about the people. And I think from a trust layer, the council, you and Lehman, the openness that, there's no other, layer one that publishes, whether it takes a week or 2 weeks or a month, that publishes the meetings and the information that's happening at board meetings. I mean, this is unprecedented. So to me, it's not just about the technology. It's also about the people. It's also about the openness, the transparency, and you guys are doing it on a level that's just not even, close to being matched by anybody else in the space. Lee, from the perspective of the trust layer, Bitcoin was kind of the initial trust layer of the internet. It established that footprint that people could rely on this network as opposed to having to rely on centralized intermediaries. Talk to us a little bit about how, the TBC has been focused on this trust layer and, how kind of you see that evolving to where a company like Hedera or a solution like Hedera provides, really an order of magnitude more to me, because you're not just, with Bitcoin, you have the ability to kind of verify a transaction between. There's very little data you can put in there. There's, like Mance was saying, the ability to kind of embed data or embed references to data, exists on Hedera. It doesn't really, but talk to me a little bit about that. What are the things you guys have seen from your perspective on kind of the trust layer evolving from where it was with Bitcoin to where it is now with things like Hedera and other trust layer mechanisms of DLT?
Sure. Yeah, it's so interesting that the general public views the digital asset ecosystem as a monolith, but we're really there's so many differences that it almost should be different. I mean, they're almost different industry verticals. You can barely put them in the same category. So Bitcoin, obviously, solving that for money, and not really. I mean, there's some ordinals and some other things people are building on Bitcoin, and that's great. And let's see where innovation takes us. But that's a big enough bite at the elephant. Let's let that solve for that problem, and then you've got other. And I see like sort of DeFi as sort of a bridge between, it's still finance, it's still, the trust layer for disintermediated lending and different things like that. And then you're coming over into the broader trust layer for the internet, which is again so different and relying on similar, it's almost like you hear echoes of the technology used in Bitcoin, but it's so different. It almost deserves its own category. And so that's what I think we struggle with on the education front is how does the general public understand that, they look at the Texas Blockchain Council and sometimes people say, man, you're in such a niche industry. And I'm like, well, if you think about it, it's actually super broad.
Yeah.
And our member companies are working on things that are incredibly different, and there's a wide array of things that they're working on. So that was what comes to mind for me is just how do we educate the community that this exists, that these different companies are building in different verticals, and trust layer for the internet is very different than what Bitcoin is building, and I think people conflate those.
I agree with you. I think it is conflated all the time. That's a great point. Mance, what are your thoughts on how that education, because we're not talking about educating the everyday consumer, really, right? We're talking about educating the next wave of innovators, the guys who are, maybe they're not the technical guys, but they're the entrepreneurs, right? And they think of, when they hear blockchain, when they hear DLT, they immediately think Bitcoin, and
I think even if you're talking about the decision makers, both corporate and elected, they have I think they even think about it the same way as a consumer does.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Even if we're not educating the consumer, even that grass tops.
I see what you're saying. So it's more about, what do you think, Mance? What do you think on that?
We had the same problem
Good point, Lee.
30 years ago. was it back in the late 80s, early 90s, before, well, I'm trying to think back. I remember trying to explain to my parents what the internet was, and they couldn't really understand it until there was a killer application that allowed them to take advantage of it. And that was email for them, right? For them, the first real use of the internet was email. And frankly, I don't think that happened until after the web was created, right? After Mosaic came out, and even post Mosaic into Netscape timeframe, did most of the population really begin to see firsthand what the internet was. It was those browsers that made it possible for the internet, for the typical user, the typical consumer rather, to understand and appreciate what the internet was. I think the same thing is going to be true here. We've seen waves of adoption. Bitcoin was the first use case, as it were, for DLT. And then we had the meme coins. We had the meme coin craze. We had ICOs, but that was just pure speculation. People wanting to make money on ICOs. I don't really consider that a use case, but the meme coins was a use case that really reached into popular culture, and the average person began for the first time to hear about and understand what digital assets were. And I think that's the way it's going to evolve as killer apps come online, and the use of those apps sort of takes hold in popular culture. Then ups or downstream from that, you might say, are the politicians or the decision makers, business decision makers, etc. It's popular culture that captures it initially, and then everything flows down from there. And so it's taken a long time, frankly. I mean, Bitcoin was 2008, Ethereum was 2015, and here we are in 2024. And so it's taken a long time to sort of germinate. But I think that the world of finance here is just primed to really begin to benefit from the tech stack. And again, I consider all of this plumbing, and the real value will be created by the developers, and then the policymakers and the business decision makers will be influenced by all of that.
So here's a good segue into kind of, you brought up the idea of a killer app, right? And you really have to have that killer app, like you said, like email. So one of our board members, her name's Elizabeth Olson. She was just on the Hill testifying about the use of AI in financial institutions. And I really think this is one of the killer apps, because what didn't exist in the early 90s with the internet was this vast information network where politicians were trying to get informed, or were getting informed. The internet was just able to flourish, and it kind of created the environment, the ecosystem we're in today. We didn't have the major kind of blockages. Sure, people were talking about it. Now, though, you hear a lot of people talking about how this is whether it's AI, whether it's DLT, there's dangers associated with it. And it's because information is just flowing faster, right? I think the same people were talking back in the internet, but now they're getting, more voice, more share of voice in wherever they're talking. Elizabeth was at testifying to Congress about a month ago, and she brought up how their credit union, their financial institution, was utilizing AI. And, one of the things that, Mance, you and I have talked about a little bit before was how this trust layer, DLT, can be utilized in conjunction with AI. Specifically, their use case was, helping customers, get to data faster, or decision faster, or outreach faster without having to interject humans from the credit union side. The one challenge with that, as I see it, is that, where are you deriving data? Where are you taking the data that they tell you and putting it? How are you segregating that data? How are you making the LLM smarter? How are you tokenizing the data coming in? And then what the regulators, what the Senate or the House was really worried about is, now that you've taken in all this data and you've put it in different places, how are you going to ensure that it's not even about breaches of some system anymore. It's like the next guy calls in and you've trained your data or you've trained your model on data from the prior guy. And now accidentally you've told somebody something about the prior calls that it didn't intend, like a hallucination, right? Like, why is it talking about Joe's, 600 credit score? I'm not Joe. I didn't ask about credit scores, but it's hallucinating. So what role can DLT, and I know that's a wide open question there, Mance, but I think there is a major role that DLT, especially Hedera, can play in, provenance of data, which is what this really comes down to, is where was that data put? Why was it put there? When was it put there? By who was it put there? And then when the regulators come in, or you're having to go in front of people to demonstrate the why and the where, you have the ability to do that. I mean, even Google, this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to you. Even Google has come out and said, we don't know why the AI has made the decision it's made. And that's not an answer that a regulator wants to hear, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. So let's make a distinction between when people hear the words AI, artificial intelligence today, they almost invariably are thinking about generative AI. AI where, as of late brought to market, where it can consume vast quantities. The model is built upon vast quantities of information. And then there is a system that sort of, I hesitate to use the word reasons about it, because, there's a lot of debate about exactly how these things work under the hood. But a system can have, the right way to think about it is the system can create content from this by taking all this information that has been traded upon, and create content that would be otherwise very difficult for us to create without a lot of effort on our own part. It's almost like that it is reasoning about it. But I was trying to make a point. I want to separate that generative AI from the earlier versions of AI, because there's AI and machine learning that are used today in the world of finance, in the world of DLT. They can be used. Algorithms that monitor blockchain transactions in real time, or can analyze data to do market predictions and asset valuations and user behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. But when we're talking about generative AI, there are these models, these massive models that get created from vast hordes of information. And the information is all important. The question then is, what information is going into the creation or construct of these large language models, the LLMs? And that is where DLT can play a role. DLT is, going back to the earlier part of this conversation about the creation of a trust layer of the internet, you have to know, ideally, where the information came from that is being used for the creation of these large language models. You want attribution, ideally, for the information that is in those models. And ideally, the people that are providing that information, ultimately we are talking about people at some point, the people that own and are providing that information should ideally participate in the financial upside of the use of that information. It doesn't work that way today, but it should.
I.e., when Facebook uses your data, there should be some reward for potentially for Facebook using your data.
Well, that's the thing. All of this information is an asset. It's just not always owned by the people that created the information in the first place. You create the information, you contribute that information to a lot of these social platforms in particular. And who owns that asset? The social platforms own the asset. And that asset is used for the creation of some of these language models. And so a guy named Jonathan Doughton of Equity Labs has done some fantastic work here. Equity Labs is using Hedera to track the provenance of the information that's going into some of these large language models that are specifically focused on climate-related use cases. He's created something called Climate GPT. And the model that he is using there is not specific to climate. It could be used for anything and everything, but that I anticipate there will end up being catalogs or registries, language models, large language models. And the value of the language model will be directly impacted or a function of the certainty of where the information came from and the quality of the information that is in the model. Well, you need a DLT to be tracking all of that. Because it's so large, these models are so large, and the information that is used to create these models is so expansive, there will end up being governance associated with the language models themselves. And it can be decentralized governance. And of course, that's the world that we live in here in the world of DLT. So everything that we've learned for decentralization and governance of decentralized ecosystems can be brought to bear in the governance of these large language models. And then finally, the people that contribute can be compensated. There can be remuneration to those people, for example, using micropayments, right? Micropayments of stable coins that happen, of course, on DLT, in this case, Hedera. So there's just a great synergy between LLMs at maturity, how LLMs are going to work at maturity, as opposed to where we are today with LLMs, and the tech that's been created in public blockchain. And that's a little bit of a flavor of it.
Well, it's, as these models become more discretized too, and smaller, right? Smaller and smaller and smaller. They're trying to put them on phones, and I think less data means potentially, more decisioning based on less data. It's even more important to know how it derived. It's much easier to create a much more robust answer from a big set of data versus a small. I think that this is going to be a major focal point moving up. Lee, do you want to add anything to that conversation?
I just said, I think what Mance said is very profound. And so, but there's maybe even a third piece of it. So Mance, tell me if I'm off here, but you're talking about the governance model for AI is very, there's some wisdom and a lot can be learned from what we've done in the DLT world. And we're also talking about micropayments, which I love that use case. And it just enables so much more. I did see, and this is probably falls within the micropayments bucket, but I did see the first AI to AI crypto transaction.
Yeah, Coinbase did it.
Yeah, like a week ago. And I think that is interesting. I mean, if you think about like a distributed energy system, or DPIN, was it decentralized physical infrastructure?
Yep.
There's going to be a lot of AI to AI transactions.
Or human to AI. I think human to AI is going to be something that happens as well.
Yeah. I don't know what your thoughts
and Mance, I think it's important to just quantify that you're not just some guy. Like you're a little bit on your background. You did AI ML research for years at the Air Force Academy.
Yeah, no, it's been a long time, but that's where my career started. In fact, that's how Lehman and I first got introduced. We worked together on a team for the senior executive in the Air Force on machine learning, and spent years doing that. Studied that in graduate school. That was my focus, was reinforcement learning in graduate school, and then taught it at the Air Force Academy as well. That's been a long time ago, but yes, that's where it all started. Lehman, is still deeply I won't say involved in that community, but well studied, and so yeah, he has some definite opinions about how this is going to evolve over time.
Well, what do you think about what Lee was saying about how this initial wave of AI to AI, human to AI?
I absolutely, and not surprisingly, I think that's where most of the transactions will occur. I mean, what we're talking about is just sort of following the natural evolution of the use of tech. It first started with humans, and then we ended up with machine to machine. And now if you look at where data is being created, the vast hordes of data that exist on the internet have nothing to do with with human interaction. It has computer to computer interaction. And that's the same thing is true for the traffic on the internet. Most of the traffic on the internet is generated computer to computer. It's not generated because somebody wants to download a video. And the databases, the databases reflect the same fact. So fully expect AI to AI transactions will be, the vast majority of AI transactions that exist. And again, it's still very early days. I'm really looking forward to the, sort of how this is going to evolve. I will say that when we talk about, we haven't touched on this, but everyone, when we talk about AI, the fear in the market, if you want to call it that, is that the latest evolution in generative AIs are going to displace white collar workers, right? I mean, AI for the first time is able to do things that white collar workers generally would do in their jobs. That may or may not play out that way. It's going to be interesting to see.
I don't know. Today, Chipotle announced their avocado robot. Did you see that? It's making guacamole. It's using AI and machine learning and robotics to make guacamole.
Well, that you're taking the conversation exactly where I wanted to go. So I don't know on the white collar piece of it, but what I do know is that robotics, or I expect, is that robotics are definitely going to have a huge impact on blue collar, right? And you raise a great example, right? What we're talking about is who is going to end up making the hamburgers and the burritos, right? Or who is going to clean the kitchens, and who is going to build the buildings, and who's going to do the physical mining work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When we talk about the future of robotics and its impact on society, coupled with AI, and AI very narrowly scoped to accomplish certain behaviors, right? To be able to take dishes and stick them into a dishwasher. That's coming, and that's going to be far more profound, in my estimation, than generative. I hesitate to say it will.
Lee, I think it's already here. I did a thing last year. You remember when you sent me to that restaurant thing? They already have kitchens that are fully, it was last year, fully AI, fully robotics. They can cook. You place an order. I mean, when you layer Internet of Things on top of that, you layer deep-in networks on top of that. I mean, you can now know where the freshest guacamole at Chipotle in town is. Like, I mean, it sounds like a funny thing to know, but the integration of all these technologies is going to be profound. Just the disruption that happens over the next couple years.
Yeah, and maybe it's likely that it won't be. It's sort of a spectrum, right? It's never as bad as everyone thinks it's going to be, but it's kind of like the maxim that we underestimate what we can accomplish, or we overestimate what we can accomplish in 1 year, but underestimate what we can accomplish in 5. So I think there's certainly be a lot of workforce displacement over the next, 5 years. But do I think that we need to, start paying a universal basic income like Andrew Yang thinks? I don't think we're going to be at that point, right? Every time you've had a huge workforce displacement due to technology, there's always been new jobs created that we can never contemplate now. And we don't know, to what extent that's going to replace previous jobs. There will be probably some policy needs that go along with that. But I usually try to stay in the middle of the road, say, yeah, we're going to need to make some adjustments, but it's not like, we're going to lose 80% of our jobs.
I agree.
And create 5%. It's probably like, yeah, we'll lose a decent percentage, and there'll be a certain percentage of that will be developed in new types of jobs that we can't even contemplate now. We just don't know what the delta between those two things are going to be. It's probably going to be relatively, it's going to be very painful as a society, but not existential.
It's going to happen. To me, the thing is, it's going to happen faster than we all expect for it to happen. It's going to snowball faster and faster and faster. And it's almost like, I don't think boiling the frog is a true statement, because the frog does jump out at some point. But, it's that that thought of it's going to be a really quick boil, and I think it will be painful for a while is my thought. But
when it comes to robotics, it's clear to me that that's going to have a societal impact, right? That we don't know to what degree, but we know that that's coming in my mind, with a greater degree of certainty than what we know today related to generative AI. And I hesitate because generative AI may turn out to just be as fantastic as everyone thinks it can be. It reached the potential that people are hoping it reaches. Right now, it's good, but it's limited, right? There's still problems. There's still real problems, and it's going to make some incremental improvements to society, but we haven't yet seen how far it can be pushed, right? We haven't plateaued on that piece of it, the generative AI piece. And until we do, I am a lot less willing to say that it's going to, impact society in a major way.
well, you mentioned that most data going across the internet is not people downloading things. Wait until this podcast drops, and then we're going to have to revisit that metric to see if that changes here. I think we're gonna get to wrapping this up. This was a really great podcast. We talked about a lot. Lee, get your closing thoughts, and then we'll let Mance have the final thoughts here.
Sure. Yeah, I think we have our Converge launch event coming up next week, which we're almost sold out for. Excited to have Ken Hirsch come to give us some thoughts on U.S. competitiveness in emerging technology. We're going to host that here at our joint offices between the multiple trade associations and companies that are up here on the 14th floor of the Merrill Lynch building. So excited about that. And I know we certainly want to ask Mance about a piece of advice for him to leave our listeners with. Was that going to be did I steal your thunder?
You did not. You got all the thunder and the lightning. Go.
Mance, hit us. Piece of advice for our listeners. And this is broad. This is not like tech advice. This is just life.
Getting deep.
A piece of advice, okay, for all your listeners. One thing that I've learned, that look, this is not profound, but it's certainly a truism that I've experienced through my life. It's going to almost seem cliche, but I never make big decisions when I am tired. I always rest before making big, and I can be impulsive, and so trying to keep a handle on that and make the business decision, the best decisions in life come after I've rested well and I give a lot of thought to it. So sleep on it. That's the sleep on the most important decisions. That's the piece of advice.
That's good. Sleep on it, seek wise counsel, and then act with decisiveness.
Fabulous. Awesome. Fabulous. Well, this was a great show. Thank you so much, Mance. Lee, always a pleasure to have you here as a co-host. And we'll wrap this up today. Thanks for joining us on the Converge podcast.